endure toil and dare dangers that achieve glorious deeds. And it is a lovely thing to live with courage and to die leaving behind an everlasting renown.
Well, with that impressive introduction by Richard Berg, we're going to take a look at the game The Conquerors, Alexander the Great, produced by GMT in 2006 and designed by Richard Berg. Now, Alexander the Great is a card-driven game, and an unusual one, because Alexander the Great had rather an unusual career, so it's only fitting that the game be a little unusual too. Now, when this came out, I don't know if it was a hit or not. I don't even know if it's still in print, but it's not been generating a lot of traffic on Board Game Geek and ConSim, and that tells me something, that it maybe just didn't catch the imagination of people. But it is a good game and a good simulation, although maybe not a good tournament game. Maybe that's why it never caught on. Anyway, we're going to look at some of the pieces of the board, and I'll give you some thoughts on the game itself. Well, as usual with GMT games, you get very good, nice-looking components. So there's some example of a battle fatigue marker in Revolt. These are Macedonian control markers. Under siege markers, when you've got a city under siege. Treasury depleted. These are used quite often. That's when Alexander builds a city and names it after himself. He had a penchant for doing that. These are weather chits to show you the weather in certain provinces. And the flip side of these battle fatigue markers are these useless markers. That's not a result you want to get in a combat. If your army becomes useless and you're hit again, your army is destroyed. So that's a pretty important marker. Over there you've got an independent tribe, the Nabatai. So the neutrals are in gray. Now, these blue markers are Persian garrisons. They're usually a strength point of 1. And as you can see, they're all over the board. But Alexander need not be intimidated by those. He can usually overrun them. Some of the neutral powers in the game are Tyre and the Ionian fleet. They're in green. And Rhodes, with its powerful fleet and army, is over there on the island of Rhodes. It's a neutral player. Way over here at Susa, we've got King Darius, the great king, and you've got his army number 1. You've got the royal family traveling with him, and the royal treasury just happens to be empty at the beginning of the game. So the armies are moved as one block. Armies are kept track of this space on the army level tracks here. So that's the way you keep track of army strength. So army number 1 for Darius is 42 strength points. Army number 2 is 40. Now you get a bunch of these number markers, and I prefer to read the army strength off as a 2-digit number. So I'm using a 4 and a 2 for 42. There are no 0 counters in the marker, so I was forced to use a group of 10s. Now I think the designer's intent was to use the markers, just add them up to your total. We found them very inconvenient because the space here is very small, so we preferred to use read it off as a 2-digit number. You've got these army tracks which keep the maximum size of your armies. You have to keep track of that. Alexander also has one. The Macedonian army maximum size is 75, while the Persian army is 175. These are the Macedonian armies. Alexander's army starts off at strength 32. His secondary army under Antipater starts at 15, and that's the elite level of the army. 4 being the best, that's Alexander's, and Antipater has an elite army of 2. You can be a 0 elite, so that's not too good. Now you've got this chart where you keep track of Alexander's injury level. A lot of you may know that he was wounded several times in his campaigns and eventually succumbed to the wounds and possibly poison. But you keep track of his injury level on this track. Now in my playings, I hardly got this track to move at all. He almost had no personal injuries. And so I'm not sure how you'd ever get to 20. But maybe I was doing something wrong or just lucky, I don't know. Now the Macedonian army also has a weariness level. Every time they get involved in combat and other various factors, this weariness level can continue, and when it gets to 20, possible mutiny results and stuff. So You have to keep that in mind. Now, let's take a look at the starting positions. Okay, that's the starting positions. That's Memnon, who is a Greek, actually fighting with the Persians. He's got army number 2. Alexander with the main army is over here at Perinthos, and the Macedonian fleet under Hegolochus is at Chernice. And these red counters are garrison markers, which Alexander can lay down as he passes through towns. He's allowed to set up 5 markers in Asia, or in Europe rather, so he'll leave some behind to garrison his own territory in case there's any revolts. Let's take a look at the overall map and situation. Now the Persian player has left some discretion as to where he puts his garrisons, so I've placed mainly the Persian garrisons on the coast and scattered them throughout the provinces. I'm not saying that's the optimum setup. I'm not experienced enough of the game to comment on whether that's the best setup or not. But the victory conditions are kind of unusual. I think we agree Alexander was an unusual kind of guy, and so the game has unusual victory conditions. In that sense, it's almost scripted, or it is scripted. Alexander has to accomplish several tasks in order to win the game. Let's take a look at what these are. Okay, now Alexander's got quite a few things he has to do. For one, he has to become the great king. To do this, he has to control certain provinces. They name about 3 or 4 critical provinces that must be controlled. He's got to capture or kill King Darius III. He has to become king of Asia, and he has to gain control of the royal family and marry the Persian princess. So even in step number 1, he's got quite a few things to do. Now some of them are quite easy. Now, capturing or killing Darius, that's going to be a task, believe me. Becoming king of Asia by just beginning an action round in Gordium won't be too bad. That's Gordium there. Now, for those of you who are familiar with the legend of the Gordian knot, anyway, Alexander had to go there, and legend was that if you untied the Gordian knot, you'd become leader of Asia. So in the game, Alexander just has to pass through there and gain control of it. We assume he cuts the Gordian knot to do so. Okay, now while doing all of that, he has to keep Greece under control. So that's way back here, of course. Macedonia had recently overrun Greece, so he has to keep control of Greece. So he can't be wandering off in Asia, conquering Persia, and not watching his back door. So he's got to watch that too. He also has to control Egypt. That's way, of course, on the other side of the board. He has to capture Alexandria. That's over here. And he has to build the city of Alexandria, which you have several counters for that. Alexander had a knack for naming cities after himself. There's a whole mess of them all over Asia. And there'd be variants of the name. I think he called one Alexander Escote, which meant it was the Alexandria city furthest from the front. So that's one of the objectives of the game, and that's quite easy to do. Just capture Alexandria, build a city, and you fulfill the victory conditions there. You've also got to establish his deity. He's got to think of himself as a god, and he does that by visiting the temple here at Siwa, which he did historically. And there's some amusing incidents with him and the priests if you read about his career there. So that's one of the objectives. Now, some of the provinces he has to control are these ones way back here, near the Persian capital of Susa. Actually, no, I think Persepolis was the capital. Susa was just a major treasure city. By the way, these yellow hexagons are treasure cities, and these are, in game terms, almost like big supply bases. So, as you can see, Alexander's got quite a few things to do. So the game is dominated by Alexander, as it should be, and you find yourself very much playing to the Macedonian tune if you're playing Persian. The Persian really has to stop Alexander. He doesn't have a lot of victory conditions himself. He's just got to thwart Alexander's plans, and that's where the meat of the game is. Okay, the cards for the game. I have to be quite frank, I'm a little disappointed in them. The backs of the cards are well done. You've got that neat painting of Alexander, I think taken from a Pompeii wall painting. But I don't know, the cards they're kind of wordy. They're very long. There's lots of cases. For example, this Bagoas card, it's got A, B, C, D, E. You got 4 different cases. They're very wordy, and the cards aren't that colorful. There's no neat pictures on them. There's an assassin card. As you can see, the text pretty well covers the card. Surprise, again, just lots of text. Here, I'll lift the deck here and see what we've got. Oligarchic counter-revolution. Determined troops. There's one illustration at least. Storms at sea, that's a good one, I remember. Neat illustration there. Satrap insubordination. Bodyguards. And there's another one with a picture. Revolt. Drought. There's 55 cards, by the way. Arhuman in a bad mood. Play at any time. Satrap insubordination again. As you can see, though, most of the cards are very text-heavy. And as we were playing the game, I don't know. I thought the cards just could have added more historical flavor. There was just something about it that the cards didn't seem to influence the game as much as I thought. Now, I might have to play more games to, get that concept under my belt. It's just that the cards, they were okay. They were functional, but they weren't really great. And in a card-driven game, you kind of expect really nice-looking cards. Okay, the combat results table, I must confess, I really liked. It's you kind of add up the strengths of your armies, your old die with a whole mess of modifiers here, and then you just, on this table, you just see who won the battle. No casualties are inflicted here. All you're rolling to see is which side won the battle. After you decide who wins the battle, you go to the second table, which is the attrition and battle loss. So it's a 2-step table. I thought it was really cool. Now in this land battle table, as we'd expect, it's very hard to defeat Alexander. In most of the battles, we found that he won. Now sometimes he won just by a hair's breadth, but he usually won. But when it came to the casualties, here's where the game kind of really shines. You can either get a great victory over the fella, or just a minor one. And it all depends on casualties. Now here's the neat part. After the defender is defeated, he always gets a battle fatigue marker on him. Okay? But here's where the game really shines. If you manage to inflict twice as many losses on the defender, he's not only battle fatigued, he's also quite useless. And boy, does that hurt. If, for example, Alexander defeats a Persian army, renders it useless, and if Alexander gets to move again and attacks and that army is defeated, that useless army is completely destroyed. So it's possible to wipe out entire armies in this game. And that's very significant, and I'll show you why. Now, wiping out armies is significant because in the strategic situation, you have very few armies on the board. As I mentioned, Alexander starts here with Memnon's army. And the other Persian army is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away here at Susa under Darius. Now, you're only allowed to have 3 armies on the board. The Persians can raise another army, which they will probably do perhaps here in the center. Alexander can also raise another army, but usually Alexander needs his forces in his army to defeat the Persians. Plus, he must keep an army back here at home to watch out for rebellions and revolts. So that's why destroying an army is so important. You only get 3 of them on the board. So if you lose a whole army, this whole front becomes open. Now, these garrison markers, they look intimidating when you're the Macedonian player at first. You look at the board and go, yikes, there's a lot of Persian counters there. But they're actually only ones. So if you're running around with an army of 33, there are overrun rules. Alexander could easily just overrun these garrisons. So these blue counters are not to be, don't be intimidated by those. Now, the card events can bring in the Rhodian fleet, which can change things, plus the revolts that can occur in Alexander's rear can change things enormously. So I'm not saying the cards don't do anything. They do. But timing is everything. When do you get the card, and what's the situation when you do get it? Now, the game has this the new the chit picking system, which is becoming very popular. And for this game, it works particularly well. You get, I think it's 8 chits, right? Yeah. Should be an administration chit in there. So depending on which chit is picked, that's whose turn it is. And you get, of course, Macedonian chits and Persian chits. So if the Persian player picks his chit, away you go, Persian turn. And if the Persian picks his chit again, away he goes. But he does have a rule for if you pick a third chit in your favor, you temporarily intercede, the other player plays, and then you play your chit. And if a player draws an administration phase chit, you do the administration phase. So there's this uncertainty about who is going to move next. And that can be very important, as I mentioned, when you fight a big battle. Because if you fight a big battle, get a useless result against an enemy, and then get to move again and hit that army's in big trouble. So that tells you a little bit about the battle system. There's not much more I can say about the game, except that it's an odd game in one sense. And I can sort of see why it is not really popular. I think Enrico mentioned this in his video. He said that it's almost like a solitaire game. And I say almost because the Macedonian player is really driving the game. Anything Alexander does is going to matter. Not that what the Persian does doesn't matter, but the Persian is very much reacting to whatever Alexander does. Alexander controls the pace of the game. So if Alexander decides to go down the coast here and overrun the Persian cities, the Persians are going to have to react to that. So the Persian player is always reacting to the Macedonian player. And I think in that sense, some players wouldn't like it because they want a more active role, a more dominating role. But I don't know. I find this game is a good simulation of Alexander's campaigns. I mean, that's what this campaign was all about. It was all about Alexander, his tremendous ego and his ability and wish to strive and conquer. So as the Persian player, you've got to thwart that. And I think it's just as interesting to play the Persian player. So that's my summary of the Conquerors, Alexander the Great. Don't know what else I can tell you about this. There is naval movement. There can be naval combat, although that's kind of kept to a minimum. There isn't a lot of naval counters. I think there's a lot of life left in this game. I think if you're an aficionado of Alexander the Great, you might want to get this game. If you're not, then certainly this is one to avoid. I don't think it would make a good tournament game. It's just not designed that way. I just can't see a tournament of Alexander the Great at WBC or anything like that. But anyway, that's Alexander the Great, The Conquerors, GMT 2006, designed by Richard Berg. Thank you for watching.